Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction and thank you for having me and giving us this opportunity. Hello, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Sina Bahrami, and I'm very happy today to present our project on the effectiveness of inductive vehicle charging, or IVC, to alleviate electric vehicle range anxiety on behalf of my colleagues, Dr. Manzuli and Professor Yapingi. So let's get started, and let me begin with the motivation for our research, which is, as you know, transportation accounts for roughly one third of greenhouse gas emission in the United States, and electrification is a way for decarbonizing the transportation sector because, for instance, electric vehicles have like a zero tailpipe emission. Also, but the EV adoption is still a little bit like limited, and one of the reasons for that is something that is known in the literature as range anxiety, which is a sort of a composition of like a limited battery ranges as well as the sparse and uneven charging station coverages in the whole transportation network, and also long charging times relative to refueling in a gas station for internal combustion engine vehicle. And even with the fast charging station, still it takes roughly 30 minutes to move from 20 to 80% state of charge, which is an order of magnitude slower than refueling in a gas station, which usually like takes less than 5 minutes. The inductive vehicle charging or wireless charging is one way, or one of the possibility of the to propose, which is proposed to mitigate this range anxiety, because it allows to transferring energy wirelessly to the vehicle, especially when the vehicle is moving. So the research question that we are set out to answer in this project was to look into the operational regime that internal combustion engine, internal vehicle charging or the wireless charging dominate the charging station, and come up with the sort of like the use cases where this technology is better than the charging stations. So before jumping into any of the models that we developed, I would like to give a quick technology premiere so we are on the same page about what is the wireless charging technology. So the wireless charging technology, as you can see in these images, is like have two types. One is the stationary, which is usually like a sort of like for the applications such as like a taxi stand or bus stop, or even like the parking spot, where the sort of like the wireless charging can be sort of like there is one sort of like a location and one spot in the pavement, and then the vehicle can sort of like charge when it's stopping over that sort of spot. Or it could be like a dynamic or in motion, where we have like a segment of the road covered by these wireless charging underneath the pavement, and then the vehicle is able to extend its charge by driving over this wireless charge. And it works based on the electromagnetic induction with resonant coupling. And as a result of that, it has like two subsystems. One is the ground assembly, and the other one is the vehicle assembly. And you need to have both these subsystems in place to be able to charge any electric vehicle wirelessly. So the roadway subsystem, as you can see in this image, usually it has a sort of like a high frequency inverter, a primary capacitor bank, and a transmitter coil buried beneath the pavement, which sort of like transfer the sort of like electricity power. And then on the vehicle subsystem, on the top here figure, you need a sort of like a pickup coil. And again, it's sort of like a second capacitor bank that sort of like transfer that energy received to the sort of like the battery. And the both sort of like coil need to be sort of like tuned under the frequency in the tons of kilohertz range to be able to sort of like have a end-to-end efficiency. And usually like the manufacturer reported that the sort of charging efficiency with this system would be in the range of 80 to 90% over an air gap of like several centimeters. And this technology is not something new. And the first time, for instance, the wireless charging has been developed and tested in the PASS program at the Berkeley in 1990s. But then in the sort of like 2009, KAIST, or the Korean Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, demonstrated the first commercial dynamic system in their sort of like campus shuttle. So to sort of like give a little bit like idea of this sort of like two assemblies here, there's like two pictures of like this ground assembly and the vehicle assembly. And as you can see, for instance, for the ground assembly, this is the sort of like the in motion or dynamic case where there is a sort of like a sort of lane of like these underground uh, transmitter, and then on the vehicle assembly you have the receiving coils, and you can see it again like depending on the sort of like the vehicle and the sort of technology, you may have like different number of like vehicle receiving coils, and these two factors impact the sort of like the charging power of like this IVC or the wireless charging. And the charging power depend on both like the type of like the technology, whether it's a static or dynamic, and also on the number of like receiving coils installed on the vehicles. Because nowadays, especially like many manufacturers report that their sort of like inductive charging are reaching a power level of like approximately like 450 kilowatts, which is sort of like comparable to the plug-in DC fast charging. However, we need to sort of like be careful, because this is sort of like usually only be achievable if the technology is stationary, and also if you have like 6 or more receiving coils installed on the vehicle, which is at least at this stage only possible for larger vehicles such as trucks and bus, that the vehicle size enable installing multiple pads. However, if you have, for instance, the dynamic case or in motion wireless charging, and also like considering the sort of like the passenger vehicle, which has like a smaller size and it's sort of like a low, only having like one or maybe two sort of receiving coils installed on the vehicle, then the sort of charging power drop to sort of like around like 20 to maybe 100 kilowatts, depending on the size of the vehicle. Which is sort of like put the technology in comparable to the level 2 charging. Yeah. So with that introduction, now let's move on to the sort of like what we did in this project in terms of like the modeling. So first, we wanted a generalized parameterized comparison between the wireless charging and the charging station that compare both technologies as alternative and identify the parameter regime where each technology can win and be more useful for enabling the electrification of the transportation sector. What we adopted is called this first principle approach, which in our usage means breaking the design problem into its fundamental cost component and constraints, rather than, for instance, focusing on a specific deployment or use case. This is sort of like in contrast with what is available in the prior literature, which tends to evaluate the wireless charging or IVC on a specific use case, and then, for instance, look into the cost effectiveness of technology for that specific use case. The advantage of like this first principle framework is that it generalizes. So when we have like this fundamental trade-off model between the two technology, we can ask under what, for instance, traffic condition and what sort of like technology condition, which sort of like charging dominates, and under what regime they sort of like we need to sort of like move from one technology to the other. Also, this approach enables us to get some sort of like analytical result, which provide like some sensitivity and closed form analysis that can, for instance, by looking into how the technology is evolving over time, adjust our result and provide a better sort of like and more up-to-date answer for which technology to look into. So the general model that we built is using a couple of like fundamental traffic and economic parameters. And for that, we defined any transportation system using 4 aggregate parameters. The first parameter that we use as sort of like our input parameter is the vehicle mile travel per unit of time, and we show that with the notation M, the average operating system of like the traffic, and we showed out as V, and we consider both cases where the speed is endogenous or exogenous. And also we consider the total system length or the total road network of like the area that we are considering, and we show that with L. And also the utilization rate of electric vehicle fleet, which is like the proportion of time that the electric vehicles are being used over the sort of like the study period. For instance, for personal vehicle, we usually, for instance, drive our vehicle maybe an hour or two over a day. And then in those cases, for instance, the utilization rate is maybe less than like 10%. But for some other sort of like use cases, such as like transit or maybe taxi services, they are being like drive for like maybe 8-10 hours of over a day, and then the utilization can change over to like 50%. Using these parameters, then we can define some other variables. For instance, we can find what are the number of vehicles that are operating in the system at any moment in time, using the sort of like the vehicle mile travel and also the average travel speed. If we divide the VMT by the speed, then we have the number of active vehicles in the system at any moment in time. Then using this active vehicle as well as the utilization of like the vehicle, we can find the number of like total fleet of the vehicle or the number of vehicle that we need to support this active fleet, which would be the NA, which is the number of the active fleet divided by the utilization. And based on this, replacing the sort of the active fluid to this, we get this again as a function of like those four parameters that we initially define, the VMT, the speed, and also the utilization. And also finally, we can also define the traffic density, which is the number of like the vehicle per the unit of distance, which would be like the active fleet divided by the total length of like the road network. Then we started defining the sort of like two generalized models for considering the two technologies, the charging station and as well as the wireless charging. So we assume that the charging station are gonna be sort of like uniformly distributed over the network, and the planner choose the number of like charging station. We show that with the N, and the subscript S is for the station, and then I use also the subscript W for the wireless charging in the next model. The planner also decide about the power of like the electricity or the charging power P, as well as the battery cost or the size of the battery for the fleet of the vehicle E here. So the objective function consider two part of like the total cost that the planner care about. The first component is the infrastructure cost, which has like a sort of like a component related to a fixed component for any station that you build, and also a second component that is related to the power of the energy that you are providing in the charging station. And also the battery cost, which is a function of like the number of like vehicles that it's owned, and also the size of the battery that it's sort of like buying for each of like those things. Then to ensure that the sort of like the network, the sort of the vehicle are able to sort of like perform. So we have like a few constraints that are considering the sort of like the charging and the sort of the movement of vehicles. So first, for instance, we had a constraint in terms of like the occupancy in each of the station. So we want to sort of like limit the sort of like the occupancy in each station to be sort of like less than a parameter rho. And then using, for instance, the beta as a parameter in terms of like translating the energy or the amount of energy or kilowatt needed to drive each mile, we can get, for instance, like this limiting the sort of relationship between the charging power and also the sort of like the number of like station that we need. Also, we want to ensure that the vehicle, considering their sort of like utilization, are able to sort of like charge, and it's sort of like visit the charging station. So the second constraint that we have here, the sort of first term is the amount of time that the vehicle spend for charging on average and each of like their visit. And the second component is a sort of like the number of times that they go to the charging station multiplied by tau, which is the access time to the charging station, should be less than the amount of time that the vehicles are down or not in use. And also, we want to ensure that the charging stations are sort of like sparse from each other, and the sort of like the distance, the battery provide enough energy for vehicles to travel among these sort of like charging stations. Similarly, we can define a model for the wireless charging or the inductive vehicle charging, where again, the planner is trying to minimize the total societal cost in terms of like the infrastructure cost as well as the battery cost. In this case, for instance, the planner decides again the sort of like the number of like the wireless segment that it builds, NW, and each segment we assume like a sort of having a length of widening in each of like these segments, as well as the sort of like the cost and the size of the battery that it's sort of like deciding for the vehicle. Again, we want to ensure that the sort of like the feasibility constraints. So in that case, for instance, first we want to ensure that the total length of the segment that we are sort of like installing the wireless charging is less than the sort of like the total road network. So the number of like the wireless lane multiplied by the length of each segment should be less than the total network length. Also, we want to ensure that the sort of like the charging that the vehicle sort of like that the energy that they sort of like gain for traveling over a sort of like a segment is more than the sort of like the traveling between the two segments, as well as the energy that they sort of gain is less than the battery capacity of like the vehicle. So these two models can be sort of like solved analytically, and then we can compare them with each other. One of the main findings that we had was this sort of like viability frontier that we got here in this figure. We have on the x-axis the traffic density, and on the y-axis we have the fleet utilization. And the two regions, the green region shows where, for instance, the wireless charging is a better or a less costly option for the planner. And the blue region is also like the area where the charging station dominate and is a sort of like a less costly option. So as we can see from this figure, for instance, the wireless charging is more cost effective when the utilization of the vehicle are generally like higher. When we have like a high utilization, then the mostly like the wireless charging is sort of like dominating. And also when we have a sort of like a medium traffic density, that is also the region that the wireless charging dominates. And in this sort of like viability frontier also, I should mention that this comes from the case when the speed is endogenous and it's sort of like related to the traffic density. And when we have very high traffic density or very low traffic density, in those cases, the charging station again dominates the wireless charging for both for all the ranges of like the fleet utilization. And one of the main reasons is that, for instance, in those cases, either the sort of like the provision of like the charging station is helping with the sort of like either one case we don't have the throughput and the other case it sort of improve the throughput of like the traffic. So with this sort of like model and this viability frontier, one of the best use cases that we consider is the sort of like the transit system. The main reason is that the transit usually operate on consistent routes, which is enabling regular usage of like the infrastructure or the wireless charging lane, because the vehicles or the buses travel on the same routes over and over, and then they can sort of like charge. As well as this is sort of eliminating the sort of like a need for increasing the fleet size to enable the electrification of like the transit system, as well as it allows, for instance, like to use the vehicle with the smaller battery sizes, which can reduce the initial cost of like electrifying the transit system. With that, we define a model to sort of like for the transit use cases where we, for instance, the planner, again, deciding to sort of like find the type of the charger and also the location of charger to minimize the total cost of electrifying the transit system, the objective function, consider the stop sort of like X as well as the segment Y in the network that sort of like install the wireless charger. And it again has like a sort of like a couple of like constraints that it needs to sort of like ensure that are satisfied. First is that the sort of like all the buses starting their sort of like a schedule with the initial state of charge that they can, for instance, like reach by charging overnight at the sort of like the depot. Then over the sort of like their service time or the sort of like their schedule, they need to always have enough energy to sort of like travel and complete the routes that are in their sort of like a schedule, as well as we want to ensure that the vehicle, when sort of like visiting a charging station or traveling over a sort of like a charging lane, it has enough, the sort of like the energy that it gains is not sort of like going over the battery capacity. So to solve this model and use some of the parameters about like the schedules of like the transit system, we use the JTFS or the General Transit Feed Specification. The JTFS has been developed in 2005 by Google to enable like the apps such as Google Maps and also other ones to be able to sort of integrate transit information into their sort of like planning. And it's a sort of like a standard format, which is now being used by more than 10,000 agencies in all over the world. And this JTFS is very useful actual data set because it provides the sort of like the routes of like any transit agency cover, as well as like the schedules of like the buses, what time they are sort of like starting their sort of like routes, and what time they sort of like be in different sort of stop location. And using that, we sort of like developed a sort of web app to show what location and what sort of like what type of charger different transit agencies are able to sort of like need to install to enable their sort of like electrification of like their system. And also to enable the transit agencies to play around with different parameters to sort of like solve that model just using their sort of like JTFS or the sort of a schedule. As you can see here, for instance, like we added like most of the urban transit agencies in the state of Michigan. For the sake of like this presentation, I'm using the RIDE, or which is the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti Transit Agency. And but the other agencies also can, for instance, like upload their even like make a copy of this sort of like web app and also upload their sort of JTFS or they and then to run this sort of like model. Then the some of like the parameters that the transit agency can sort of like select is one, the sort of like the bus ranges or that they sort of like considering to buy, for instance, like what is the range of like those buses, and then they can also play around with these values. Also, the sort of like the charging power. So we consider two cases, again, the stationary and in motion charging. And for the stationary charging power, because they can also have the case of like, for instance, like the plug-in charger at each stop, for instance, they have that. But if it's a plug-in, we need to consider the sort of like the setup time or the time that it needed to sort of start charging, which is, for instance, if it's a plug-in, maybe the driver needs to get out of the vehicle, plug the vehicle to the charger, and then sort of like start the charging. as well as, for instance, like the in-motion charging, which would be in that case like the wireless charging. So with this sort of like input parameter, for instance, we run the analysis, then this sort of like what we do is sort of like it's read the JTFS data and solve the previous model that I show. And then it start to sort of like providing some sort of like results about this sort of case and also map the results. So first of all, for instance, it generalized like some of like the information that, for instance, this transit system have like 31 routes and it has like over 1,000 stops, and it includes 98 blocks. And the blocks are in the sort of, for those of you who are not familiar with the JTFS, is the set of like consecutive routes that are assigned to a single bus over its sort of like schedule. And that is, for instance, usually even in the sort of like transit system, like when the sort of like the drivers show up in the morning, they are sort of assigned a block and then they go and input that into the sort of like machine that is installed at the front of like their vehicle. And it tells them, for instance, which route they need to cover. And then we can see with this, for instance, like information, it sort of says that the sort of like the 63 blocks can be electrified out of this 98, 35 cannot be electrified. And to, for instance, electrify these 63 blocks, you need 2 stationary chargings. And also it sort of like present a map of like the routes as well as like the location of like these 2 chargers, which is one, for instance, like here, for those who are familiar with Ann Arbor, it's sort of like the major transit for the university and also the sort of like the Ann Arbor Ypsilanti transit system, as well as another one which is in the southeast of Ann Arbor, where also we have like some Tesla charging station, as well as it's near the sort of like a big grocery store, which usually like the buses stop for quite some time. But if we, for instance, change this one to sort of just like a wireless charger, maybe like we can say that in the case of like this is a wireless charger, the vehicle can start charging that in less than, for instance, 30 seconds. If we run the analysis again, this model sort of like read all those sort of like the JTFS schedule, as well as like solving the mathematical model to find where it needs to sort of install these charging facilities and how it sort of impact the sort of like the location. And as you can see, even by, for instance, switching to the wireless charger in this situation, because the vehicle are able to use some of like those downtime at the end of like that, the stops, they are able to, for instance, like increase the number of blocks that can be electrified from like 63 to 96, and only 2 blocks cannot be electrified without, for instance, in motion charging. And in this case, you need 4 charging stations, which again, it shows like the location. And here, for instance, we have also like another sort of like transit hub, like or main station in Ypsilanti, the other sort of like small city next to Ann Arbor, which this sort of like transit agency cover both. And then finally, if we have, for instance, also in motion charging cover and run the analysis, it sort of like look into the sort of like the analysis and also place the wireless charger or in motion wireless charger to enable the whole system to be electrified in this case. And it also find the location for these tracks. So also like some other parameters, while this is sort of running on this sort of left panel, the sort of like the agencies can, for instance, also look into the energy usage of like the buses and how sort of like depending on the weather condition or maybe the technology of like the vehicle, they can change that parameter in this sort of like analysis. Or even they can look into a specific route or block and also have like the economic analysis where they can, for instance, input the cost for different sort of like option in terms of like the price of the buses, as well as like the cost of each of like these chargers. And in this case, for instance, we see that when we have also the in motion charging, all the sort of blocks can be electrified. In this case, for instance, there is more charging station you need because previously, for instance, those 2 blocks that couldn't be electrified. As a result of that, even like it didn't install the stationary chargers, but now with the help of like the dynamic wireless charger, you can also install the sort of like you can enable all the blocks, and as a result of that, you may need more stationary chargers as well, which shows the location of them. And also here it shows the location of like the in-motion wireless charger track, which again, for those who are familiar, this is part of like the State Street before the sort of like the intersection of like Packard, which is one of like the busiest and it's sort of like the multiple like the traffic signals here. And usually like the vehicle stop a little bit longer. And as a result of that, the speed of travel here is lower. And as a result, it sort of like benefit more by having like the wireless charger here. And also it generates a sort of like report as well for the sort of like the transit agencies based on the that sort of enabled them to sort of like how is the sort of the this the location, the sort of the location, and also the sort of like the blocks that are not being covered. So yeah, the other case that we talked about is the sort of like a single trip case, because when we look into the sort of like the trips that are completed by distance in the state of Michigan, for instance, there are a handful, like there is a portion of like the trips, which are like usually less than 1% that are more than 500 miles. And these trips usually being considered as a sort of like a reason why people, for instance, do not shift to electric vehicle, because, for instance, you want to do a sort of like a summer trip over the states, and those trips, for instance, are longer and then use above the sort of like the range of the vehicle, and as a result of that, maybe people would not consider switching to electric vehicle. But one of the important factors we want to consider was the sort of like the time saving and also the possibility that you can sort of like gain from having like this switching to electric vehicle, as well as, for instance, having the access to the wireless charge. However, we know that usually for this long distance trip, we need to sort of like take some breaks. And many studies, for instance, suggest that having like a break during this extended trip can mitigate the risk of accident as a result of like fatigue. And even for heavy duty vehicles, for instance, there are some limit in the terms of like the number of hours that these heavy duty vehicles, such as trucks, can travel and drive over the course of a 24-hour, which is, for instance, any trucks is only able to drive a 14-hour during the 24-hour period. And even during this 14-hour driving window, they can only drive for 11 hours, and they need to take a break after 8 hours of like driving. So considering these factors, we built another sort of like model. First, we sort of like have a strong assumption that sort of like any electric vehicles need to take a break after driving for a maximum number of hours. And also the duration of like these rest periods are fixed. And there is a sort of fast charger available at every rest stop. And the vehicles, for instance, when they are sort of stopping for rest, they charge their vehicle regardless of like the state of their battery, and also the sort of like the needed for the whether there is a wireless charger or not. With that, when we consider, for instance, first a sort of like a hypothetical case for different lengths of like trips and different sort of like battery sizes, we find that the sort of like the time saving that you can gain from the sort of like having wireless tracks or not is very limited, especially if like you have a very like a high range or a larger battery electric vehicles, for instance, because in those situations, like some of like the electric vehicles like Lucid, I think they have like some models that have like a 500-mile driving range. And in that case, for instance, like every 8 hours, you are sort of like consuming your battery. you stop for half an hour charge, and then again you gain, for instance, like enough charging to continue your trip. So with that, then we sort of relaxed this sort of assumption that we had in terms of availability of the charging. And we consider the state of Michigan, because this project was also supported by the Michigan Department of Transportation, where we consider different like sort of like major cities that are sort of like distributed over the network of like the state of Michigan. Also, we get the sort of like data about the location of like the fast charging, and we consider like how much is like the time saving and the sort of like the distance saving if you travel among between these different cities and the state of Michigan, with and without the availability of like the wireless charge. And even in these sort of like cases, we realize that, for instance, the time savings are again very minimal for a single trip, and usually those is like a less than an hour saving in term if you have access to the fast charging, which are, for instance, right now available over the state of Michigan, over the whole network, that you can travel and stop for charging and combine that with the sort of like rest stop that you are taking during, for instance, completing a long distance trip from, for instance, the Southeast Michigan in Detroit or Ann Arbor to the sort of like the Upper Peninsula area like Marquette, to sort of like go over there to visit. So with that, I'm sort of like summarizing some of the findings that we had. First of all, like the IVC or inductive vehicle charging is not a universal solution. It is most useful viewed as a targeted tool for a specific operational regimes within a rapidly evolving electrification landscape. Also, the general economic model that we built gives us the characterization of like this regime, which is like a high traffic density combined with the high fleet utilization, is where the wireless charging lanes dominate the stationary charging station on a total societal cost basis. Also, this as a result of that, for instance, we find that the public transit operation is the one of the sort of like the best and initial use cases, because also the transit system usually drive and operate over a fixed routes. And the choice between the plug-in, the stationary wireless, and in-motion wireless in the transit system, again, is a sort of like a is fundamentally an economic one, because the transit system need to balance between the sort of like the cost of like the installing the wireless chargers on the vehicle side, as well as the wireless road, as or the option of considering increasing their sort of like the fleet size, or maybe making some adjustment to their sort of like a schedule as well. But also some other important factor is that with the sort of like the increases in the EV range, the single trip time saving for the wireless charging is very limited. And also in general, with the sort of advancement in the battery charging technology, and considering, for instance, the option of ultra fast charging, which at least in some of like the study, they state that the sort of ultra fast charging can speed up the sort of like the charging of like the electric vehicle to less than like 5 to 15 minutes, and make it more comparable to refueling gas station. That are important to consider the impact on the IVC, and it can sort of like diminish the benefits of like the wireless charge. And with that, I would stop here, and I would like also to thank again the CCAT and also the Michigan Department of Transportation for their help and support for this project. And I would be happy to answer any question. And I'm sorry that my internet was not well, and I lost for a few seconds, I think, in between.
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all. Thanks for taking the time. Yeah, we've got some questions from folks they asked in advance of the webinar, so I think you've addressed these a little bit, but maybe we can go a little more in depth. And one of these questions is, can inductive charging ever achieve efficiency at the same level of connected charging at similar cost, Is this something that could happen with innovation? I've heard there's an efficiency loss in inductive charging, but is this unavoidable?
Think in terms of like the efficiency, in terms of like charging, I think they are comparable to the plug-in charging. They are sort of like now claiming like at least over 90% efficiency in terms of like charging. Cost is another factor, but I think the cost, when you look into the sort of like cost, there was a lot of like different factors, and it's about, I don't like when you want to sort of like bring that one into the equation. It depends on many factors. For instance, for both of technology, like the grid network, like is one factor that impact the sort of like the cost of installation, like both the station, charging the station or wireless charger. If those are the sort of like not into sort of like you remove those from the equation, I think again they are sort of like comparing the cost is comparable. But for instance, for the station, you need in a location wise versus for instance, wireless track, you need it over the course of like some segment of the road. So that is another fact. And also like the pavement costs, whether for instance, you count the sort of like redoing the pavement and digging into the pavement into the sort of like cost of like this technology, or is it for instance like sometimes we have like the maintenance in the pavement and we do this sort of like installation of the technology at the same time that we go to over that sort of like construction and maintenance, that is also impacting the sort of like the cost. So if without considering the cost, I think the efficiency is the same, but when you look into the cost, usually the parameters that you see is very different, and it depends on all these factors, which is very case specific and like a case dependent.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question is from your perspective, expertise, conversations, and research, how can we make inductive charging practical? Right now, it's a great toy, but no more. But it has so much potential. Can we standardize technology and get out of proprietary technology that keeps the cost high and retrofitting almost impossible? Also, what would it take for OEMs to buy into this or allow retrofitting without voiding the warranty? That's a lot.
Think that is, yeah, that is, I think, one of the biggest challenge. I think there was some answer, some of the answer in the question itself about the OEMs buying into this, because one of the biggest challenges in this sort of technology, I feel, is coming from this installation of the coils or receiving coils on the vehicle side. The only, I think, manufacturer right now in the US market that provide that option is like BMW, and also for one specific model that you can have that receiving coil being installed on the vehicle side. But the other sort of like models and other sort of like even vehicle types, that is becoming a little bit like who is responsible for, especially like the warranty of the batteries. For instance, like I think because also like the battery is one of the most important sort of like cost factor in these electric vehicles. And it's sort of like a question of like who take the risk for that. And I think if OEMs get into this sort of technology and sort of like provide at least the option of installing the receiving coil, that is a big step toward sort of like implementation and sort of making this more possible. And as a result of that, I think that's why also we suggest, for instance, transit, because I think in those situations, the public agencies sort of like have both sides of like the technology. They are sort of like in charge of like the installation of like the infrastructure in the road network, as well as because they are owning the fleet, they are maybe able to sort of like take those risk a little bit, and that provide the opportunity later on for the other sort of like sectors, such as private sector, when they see the technologies available, they are going through that route to install that receiving coil on their vehicle side. But it's a very sort of like, I would say, very the technology is changing at least fast, especially I think when it comes to the battery technology in the recent years, and also the ultra fast charging, which is nowadays being talked about a lot.
Yeah, on the topic of transit agencies, I was curious if that online platform that you showed about halfway through your presentation, have you shared that with like AAA or the U of M bus fleet? And I guess what was their feedback? Were they
Yeah.
interested in using it?
Yeah, we actually we shared that one with the UM Transit Agency and also a few other agencies in the state. And actually based on some of their feedbacks, we changed a little bit like the sort of like the web app and also add some other feature. For instance, like the report that I wasn't able to show at least during the presentation. It was something that they were interested because they were seeing some of this result, but they wanted to know a little bit like back end information about which are the sort of like some of the blocks that have like this limitation or even like the specific location for this sort of like the location of the chargers and everything, as well as like some of like these cost analysis that I didn't show it during the presentation, but they can play a little bit with the sort of like the cost of like the buses, because for instance they have the option of maybe buying more buses to enable their sort of like their electrification. So with that also it does those type of things. And at least for the University of Michigan, because they are sort of in the, I think, considering this sort of like installation. So some of the result when they use this, it was similar to what they are doing in their sort of like cases. So they were very interested and they provided also like, yeah, some of these feedbacks. But some other agencies, I think still they are a little bit like have like limited resources, or at least hasn't moved towards that sort of like electrification of the whole transit system to sort of like consider all these options. But also it provides them a little bit like idea about that they can start by some of their routes or especially like some of the blocks to electrify them without even need to use this sort of like wireless charger, and then eventually maybe over time they can sort of like gradually move to the full electrification of the whole system.
Yeah, I know AAATA is currently not electrified, but whenever that time comes, I'll be happy to connect you and you can show them your platform. I think they would find it very useful. So,
Great.
we have another
Thank you.
question from George. Appreciated the presentation. Could you speak to any exploration of the topic of utility connection, station charging versus inductive?
Not sure exactly what the utility connection means. And
Let me
I think
see
in
if
this,
George, is George still online? Yeah, George, if you want to unmute, you're more than welcome to. Let me promote you. And then George, if you want to unmute, you can ask Sina your question. I think you're currently muted. There we go.
Yeah, I think I just unmuted there.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a question on whether this research explored just the impacts of utility connections and if there are more connections needed, say in a transit uh, a transit use case, like what the impacts would be of having to connect to the grid in multiple places for that inductive charging roadway versus an individual station. I didn't know if that was part of what the research was looking at.
okay, yeah, I think I understand your question. Try to answer it to my best knowledge. I think the when you have like a sort of like the charging, especially when it's, for instance, like a stationary wireless charger or plug-in, there is not much difference in terms of like the technology when you want to connect it to the sort of like the grid network. For both of them, you need to have the access to the sort of like the utility network. And after that, sort of like the difference in terms of like providing that sort of outlet is a little bit like in terms of like the installation requirements and installation details. Other than that, there is not much difference, and there is not also much difference in terms of like cost of providing that sort of outlet. But for the sort of like the in motion or the sort of like the dynamic charging or the sort of like a wireless segment, that is you need, of course, you need to sort of have access to a little bit like in a longer segment. But again, you can provide the electricity even from a few sort of like input locations. So it's not that you need, for instance, a constant access to the sort of utility over the course of the whole segment, versus, for instance, you have like at least a few locations to sort of install that connected to the sort of like the grid network or utility network. Not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah. So the grid connections could be relatively limited at the input points in an inductive system.
Right. Yeah. It's similar to the sort of like, inductive system as well. Like, so for an inductive system as well, you need to have access to the sort of the utility network and be connected to that. So especially for a stationary, there is no difference, at least based on the discussion that we had with these companies. So for both of them, you need to have access to the grid network and the utility network, and there is not difference. But when it's a wireless or the sort of in motion, then you have a little bit more, you need a little bit more sort of like access points rather than a single access point to the utility grid.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, George. All right, I think with that we can wrap up today's webinar. So I want to thank Dr. Bahrami for taking time out of their busy schedule for joining us today.